Hello, everyone. Welcome to Of Wild Grains and Olive Groves, Flavor, Biodiversity, and the Mediterranean Kitchen. Thank you to Toribera Mediterranean Center for collaborating with us today on this presentation. As a reminder, you can find Chef Aaron's demonstration recipe available for download below the screen. Without further ado, it would be my pleasure to welcome our moderator and one of our presenters, Anne McBride, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Casey. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Anne McBride, the Deputy Director of the Toribera Mediterranean Center, a joint project of the CIA and the University of Barcelona, which focuses on, and let me share my screen so you can see, this is the campus where we are in Barcelona, on the food campus of the University of Barcelona. And the goal of the project is to focus on preserving and advancing the Mediterranean diet, particularly in food service and food manufacturing applications. Thank you so much for joining us for this breakout of Wild Grains and Olive Groves, Flavor, Biodiversity, in the Mediterranean Kitchen. So we're going to talk Mediterranean, Basin, and California, two regions that have a lot more in common than they have in differences, with an overview of agrobiodiversity issues and a look at olive oil and cereals before going into a deep dive into whole grain breads and tartines with a culinary demo and presentation by CIA's own Aaron Brown. So, and this is not one of his tartines, but it's a great example of what you can do with Mediterranean foods. Before jumping into that, though, I want to tell you a little bit more about the Mediterranean Center, the Toribera Mediterranean Center. So it's an academic center that addresses vital public health and sustainability issues, focuses on adoption of Mediterranean dietary patterns in restaurants, food service, in food manufacturing, and at home, and not just in the Mediterranean, but really all over the world, and looking at how do we take these traditional foodways and make it into a 21st century project with contemporary applications. And to do that, we work with scientists, chefs, cookbook authors, the food manufacturers to really have a triangular relationship where all of these interactions and these elements function really at the core and foster the most practical applications for everyone. We are in 2021, we're doing a Tumortis Mediterranean conference in November, which will have a virtual component, digital magazine in the fall also, and we are working on hopefully developing a podcast. We also do training, virtual and presential, pretty much anywhere. We just did a program last year with World Chefs and Griffiths Food on a sustainable nutrition module for the Feed the Planet program, in case you're familiar with that. We also do editorial content, and we do a research program. We're working right now on research in nursing homes in Spain, for example, and applications of the Mediterranean diet for the health of the patients there. Speaking of Tumortis Mediterranean, so that is our conference, and that is a digital magazine. We released the first issue in January, so you can go to tumortismediterranean.com and .org. You can download the magazine, and you can also listen to a recording of our 2020 conference. And I'll just give you a little preview of what the magazine looks like. This is the table of content. It has about 23, if I remember correctly, recipes also as part of that, a roundtable, case studies, interviews, all with, for the food service industry. So very relatable to what you're doing. Here are some more visuals. That's always very important. It's great to have lots of good words, and there's tons of that, but we also wanted to make sure that this is the kind of magazine you want to flip through, so our designer did a really beautiful job. And one element there is on iconic plan-forward ingredient dishes and techniques of the Mediterranean. So there's an assortment of ingredients, recipes, techniques, etc., that are really specific to the region, with recipes that work on a variety of level. A lot of them are great for summer. So again, tumortismediterranean.org to go and download that. Now, diving more specifically into the topic of this session, and which connects to what we're doing with Tumortis Mediterranean in 2021, where we're covering and focusing on biodiversity, among other things, but was really a big spotlight there. With its plan-forward character, the Mediterranean diet broadly creates a lighter food system impact on the natural world, leading to less loss of biodiversity. At the same time, the greater Mediterranean basin into the Middle East has been the source of many of today's valued food crops, from olive oil and tree nuts to grains and greens, with their essential biodiverse genetic material that demands preservation, in part because of future untapped applications yet for human health. So, biodiversity refers to the variety of living organisms within a given area. And for our purposes, we're really looking at agrobiodiversity, which the FAO defines as the variety and variability of animal, plants, and microorganisms that are used directly or indirectly for food and agriculture, including crops, livestock, forestry, and fisheries. It comprises a diversity of genetic resources, varieties, breeds, and species used for food, fodder, fiber, fuel, and pharmaceuticals. It also includes the diversity of non-harvested species that support production, soil microorganisms, predators, pollinators, and those in the wider environment that support agro-ecosystems, agricultural, pastoral, forest, and aquatic, as well as the diversity of the agro-ecosystem. And some numbers here from the FAO also. More than 6,000 plant species have been cultivated for food. Currently, fewer than, those numbers are from a 1999 report. So about 20 years, but that has not yet improved. Fewer than 200 of those plant species make major contribution to food production globally, and only 9 account for 60% of total crop production. So if you think we have 6,000 species, only 9 account for 66% of total crop production, so very limited. And 33% of fish stocks are overfished. Actually, sorry, those numbers are from 2019, not 1999. I had found a more recent report. And reported threats to associated biodiversity by region, you can find the PowerPoint on the resources of menus have changed. You can look at it more closely, but I wanted to look specifically, since we're talking about the Mediterranean, at Europe and Central Asia. So the habitat alteration and loss accounts for 43%, the greatest 43% of threats, deforestation for 45%, and then not reported is 46%, also a fairly large percentage, but 43. And then pollution, obviously a big threat with 17. Now, looking more closely at the Mediterranean basin. So the Mediterranean basin biodiversity hotspot, which is how it's classified, is the second largest hotspot in the world. And if you're like me and you were wondering, the tropical Andes is number 1. So the Mediterranean basin hotspot covers more than 2 million square kilometers and stretches west to east from Portugal to Jordan and north to south from Italy to Cabo Verde. The Mediterranean basin is the third richest hotspot in the world in terms of plant diversity. Approximately 25,000 plant species occur here, 60% of which are unique to the Mediterranean basin region, and about 1/3 of the Mediterranean fauna is endemic. What are the main threats to Mediterranean species? Habitat loss and degradation, for sure. For example, through dam construction and coastal infrastructural development, those are the major causes of Mediterranean species high risk of extinction. Pollution, drought, alien invasive species, and overexploitation, whether it's overfishing, overhunting, or overharvesting, are all important factors. And let me just put a side note here about alien invasive species. If you garden at home, even if it's landscaping, not necessarily food gardening, think of what plants are native to your area and versus what is imported. Definitely don't put bamboo in your garden. I have some in my backyard that, as you know, is very, very invasive. But think about things like that. What comes from your area, look at local nurseries and then plant native species, because that's really what you can do best for your soil. Sidebar and back to the Mediterranean. Other elements are external drivers such as global global climate change, for example, obviously really a big threat in the Mediterranean region as in the rest of the world. And at the EU level, almost a quarter of species are threatened with extinction, and the majority of ecosystems are degraded to the point where they are no longer able to deliver their valuable services because of climate change. In the Mediterranean basin in particular, some of the biggest issues are pressure on water resources, especially loss of freshwater habitat. The construction of dams threatens 32% of freshwater fishes, for example. Another sad common element that the Mediterranean and California have in common is forest fires. And the basin is one of the world's region most prone to forest fires. Climate change obviously only increasing that. Pollution, whether it's from toxic chemicals, pesticides, sewage, so both from urban and agricultural sources. And then a phenomenon that threatens culture as much as environment, both agricultural intensification and land abandonment. So high volume farm operations, but fewer farms overall. And that has a strong impact on biodiversity, and then of course on social elements, on cultural elements, etc., on traditions. That's how you end up with a lot more convenient products as people move towards urban center, have different careers. It's the same as has happened in the US, and that's happening throughout the Mediterranean. Infrastructure and residential development is another big threat in the Mediterranean basin, coming from urbanization, as I was just mentioning, but also from tourism. And as you know, it's one of the most popular regions in the world for tourism. Spain, and especially Barcelona, consistently rank extremely high in favorite destinations for tourists. So that means hotels, cruise ship ports, et cetera, that has a huge impact on biodiversity. It also requires the creation of more roads, the creation of airports, which replaces natural habitats for plants and animals with concrete and other man-made structures, which impacts not just the habitat of the permanent animals, but also migration patterns. And I'll, in the last of this brief overview, and tune in to Tomortis Mediterranean's conference and magazine in the fall for more. We just have a few minutes here. I just wanted to share a couple of projects related to agrobiodiversity, particularly spending a little bit more time on olive groves, since Erin will talk about grains shortly. So the first is an EU project, and a lot of the projects that you'll see related to biodiversity are between different countries, different universities, and with funding from the European Union. So it's called Life Olivares Vivos, Olives Alive is how they refer to it in English. It concluded in fall 2020. You can read a little bit more about that in the current issue of the magazine at tomorrotismediterranean.org. And so in Europe, about 5 million acres or 5 million hectares or 12 million acres are of olive groves, and that's one of the main crops in Greece, in Italy, in Portugal, in Spain, and there's 1.9 million olive farms in Europe also, so it's a huge sector of employment. So the big issue around that led to this study is that olive groves were intensely cultivated, so created a loss of biodiversity, a weakening of green infrastructure. And so they put in place these big efforts to change that through the Olive Alive project. Through a survey of 27,000 residents of 27 European Union countries, 52% said that one of the main objectives of Europe agricultural policy should be environmental protection and fight against climate change. So the research around the olive oil in Spain especially is that the olive grove is a great sustainable solution for that, because for every kilo of greenhouse gas generated during the production of 1 liter of olive oil, the tree can fix 10 kilos of greenhouse gases in the soil and in the tree itself. So 1 kilo of emission can fix 10 kilos in the soil and the tree. So huge beneficial impact there. And there's also a unique ecosystem in the olive groves. This image is one from our magazine, so it's turned into an illustration, but it just gives you an idea of the kind of system where you can have ecosystem where you can have with lots of birds and other plants in there. So in Andalusia alone, which is the bigger area of production in Spain, in 40 different olive groves, they found 165 species of bird, or a quarter of all the bird species found in the Iberian Peninsula. So this is why it's important when you have great olive oil cultivated biodynamically, organically, etc. This is hugely beneficial for animals as well. They also found 58 species of ants and 100 species of bees, 549 different types of herbaceous plants, and 137 woody plants, to give you an idea. So, and then in Spain, about 30% of the olive groves are irrigated, and 95% use drip irrigation. So the key elements of this international project, and here is the article that we have on that, were to define an innovative model of olive growing with high demonstration value, which means agriculturally, economically, and socially viable, while contributing to a halt in the loss of biodiversity in the EU. And then the last project here is a new one that is just starting, also a collaboration between multiple countries, is through the Prima network, and we have the director of Prima as one of our advisory council member, and it's called Cereal Med. You might be familiar with PrediMed, which is the big study on the prevention of cardiovascular diseases with the Mediterranean diet supplemented by extra virgin olive oil or nuts, and you've probably heard Ramona Strouk present that. Menus have changed before on that. So Cereal Med is a big multi-country wheat research project. It's not about public health as much as it is about biodiversity, and here is a little bit what they're doing. So looking at an increase in crop genetic diversity combined with less intensive agro techniques and the favorable effects that this could have. So this is just launching. The call for collaboration, if you want, was published a few months ago. So stay tuned for more on that. Now, here's how you can reach us for more. We also have something in the Innovation Hub at the next break, a booth, so come visit us there. And now let's get to the food. So I am very happy to have live from Copia, Erin Brown, Associate Professor of Baking and Pastry at the Culinary Institute of America at Greystone. And before coming to the CIA, Erin started Big River Breads, a wholesale artisan bakery in Oregon, and he started the cafe operation class for baking and pastry at Greystone. There is really no one better to talk to us about breads and whole grain. So Erin, welcome.
Thank you very much, Anne. I appreciate you having me. I've made a bread that really highlights what Anne just discussed in her presentation about how we can change the diversity of grain and grain growing, and then also use those grains in breads and how we use those breads in order to make special dishes. As an American baker, my training was really all about fermentation and the flavor of fermentation and the crust and the crumb of the bread. I could tell you all about the different acids that are created in fermentation. I can tell you about the caramelization of sugars, but I could never really tell you about the flavor of wheat, which is odd since we use, of course, so much wheat in baking bread. And this is true even though here in the United States, in 2019, we farmed over 50 million acres of land in wheat. Most people can't accurately describe the flavor of wheat, which seems really unfortunate. Of course, most of that wheat is grown in a very industrial way, stripping the topsoil through lots of tillage, harming pollinators through use of petrochemicals. The grains that we use to make flour are then typically milled in a very industrial way, where we strip out the bran and the germ which is really where we carry that flavor as well as the nutritional content in the flour. So as bread bakers, we have an opportunity really to make change in a really significant way. I think that part of it is helping our customers understand that there is a flavor to the bread other than that flavor of fermentation and that acidity that comes from a lot of breads and that fermentation. And we could do that by developing an awareness, doing what I'm doing here, showing my customers how to use these breads, and helping them to be aware of the different flavor profiles of the different grains that we use to make bread. We can also create very specific relationships with the farmers and the millers that are growing wheat that is farmed in a very sustainable and also an eye to biodiversity. And by doing that, we then again come back to the customer and able to explain that to them and really show them the importance of that in the bread and in the grains that we use. Here on the West Coast, we have several breeders and wheat growers that are really involved in creating heritage grains. The Mendocino Grain Project, Washington State University Bread Lab up in Washington State, and Karen Springs Mills, which is also not only a miller, but they also are a grain grower up in southern Washington. So the bread that I made is inspired by a traditional French bread called pain aux céréales, which is a way of using not only whole wheat flour and whole grain flour, but also actually using whole grains in the bread. The great thing about what I do as a teacher at CIA Greystone, where I teach, is that I have my own stone mill, and so I'm able to mill all of my whole grain flours for my classes, which is pretty exciting. So I want to show you the video, a quick video, and in that video, I want to go through the process of not only explaining some of the grains that I use, but also some of the aspects of how the bread itself was made.
And Aaron, I'll leave you to that, and I'll be back on stage with you afterward for some questions. So put your questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and we'll have time for that from Aaron, and can't wait to see the video.
Great. Thanks, Ann. We'll see you in a minute. So here's some soft wheat. We use soft wheat for pastry flours and other kind of softer breads. You can think buns and things like that. This is a wheat called Sonoran white wheat. This was originally bred in the Southwest for making flour tortillas. This slightly darker wheat is called einkorn, which is an ancient forebearer of modern wheat and still the most primitive form of wheat that we grow. This is durum wheat. Of course, we're using durum wheat mainly for pasta, but it also creates an interesting flavor and strength to bread. This is hard red winter wheat. This is really the most of the grains that we use to make bread flour. This is rye. This is a low gluten flour, but also has a really nutty flavor. And then finally, this is buckwheat, which not only is a flowering plant, is incredibly nutritious, but it also creates a beautiful purple hue to the bread. For this recipe, what I did with the whole grains is I'm cooking the grain berries just to soften them. Grains cooked this way are also good for making grain salads. The great thing about whole grains is they can also be soaked and sprouted. The grain milling process is very simple. We just put grain into a hopper. There's 2 millstones that grind that grain into a fine powder, and then it comes out the other side. These types of mills recently have become incredibly popular for bakeries to mill their own fresh flour in their bakeries. So I'm going to start out by combining all these ingredients. I'm going to make this bread by hand. Mixing by hand without aggressively kneading the dough is a great way to use whole fresh milled flours to make bread. I'm adding the water, levain, and then I break up the levain into little pieces. The levain not only leavens the bread, but also adds flavor through fermentation. The levain was made about 3 to 5 hours earlier and allowed to ferment at room temperature. This is what we typically refer to as sourdough starter in the United States. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add all the flours, and I'm going to mix them just enough to hydrate the flour. And then what that does is that activates the large amount of enzymes that are present in fresh milled flour. So I'm just going to mix that together, get in there with my hands. Then once that process is done, I'm gonna leave that covered for about 30 to 45 minutes. This is a process that we use in the bakery all the time, even when we mix by machine, called autolyse. The great thing about autolyse is that we're actually able, just by letting the bread sit or the dough sit and ferment, it actually creates gluten without mechanical mixing. This is important when using fresh milled flours because oxidation of the dough also typically means that we're going to lose some of that very unique flavor. So the next step, after I get done cleaning my hands here, and the next step is that I'm going to add the salt. The purpose of waiting to add the salt is salt actually slows the enzymatic activity. So I don't add the salt prior to the autolyse. So now the next thing I do in order to incorporate that salt is that I'm going to wet my hands a little bit. This is pretty important because this is a very high hydrated dough. The dough will likely have absorbed a lot of water while it was resting during the autolyse. This is another benefit of fresh milled flour is its ability to absorb a lot of water. So I'm just adding enough water to soften the dough a little. Now, for commercial bakers, the reason why adding water is important is that that helps us to maintain the perception of freshness when we sell bread in grocery stores and when we sell it to restaurants. So notice that I'm not kneading the dough in the traditional manner that we may see in a lot of recipe books. I'm just folding it over a few times. This process of folding the dough and allowing it to rest as a technique for kneading is how bread has been made for thousands of years prior to the invention of the mechanical mixer. So based on the amount of gluten that I want to develop will dictate the number of folds that I'm going to put into that dough. So now I'm going to cover it and let it rest for about 30 minutes. So now, in the same way that I added the salt, I'm going to add the cooked grains and the soaked seeds. For this recipe, I use millet and flax. The process of folding creates a little gluten, but mostly the production of gluten happens while the dough is resting through the enzymatic activity and fermentation caused by the levain. Adding the soaked grain and cooked seeds by hand is a great way to add those inclusions into the dough. When we add those inclusions by using a mechanical mixer, the seeds and grains can tear the gluten structure. This makes the bread somewhat flat. Folding them in is a much better way to accomplish that. So notice that I continue to add little bits of water as needed. This will be depending on the water content of the fresh milled flour. So depending on the water content of the grain berry that I milled to make flour will sort of dictate the hydration of the flour before I add it into the dough, or the water content is probably a more appropriate way to say that. So then I allow the dough to rest, and I repeat the folding and resting process 2 more times. The dough is then gently shaped into a ball on a lightly floured work surface. I'm just going to keep adding water to that. One of the things that is important about this style of bread making is being able to repeat this process many times in order to get the understanding of how much that dough absorbs that water and the seasonality if you will, of the flour that will change over the seasons. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to gently shape the dough. This is on a lightly floured bench. I'm going to use a reed basket that's covered with a little cloth that we call a couche. The basket is called a banneton. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip that dough over. I'm going to fold it over on itself a couple of times. And that folding is going to create a round shape. Then it goes seam side up into the banneton. Now, the great thing about making bread this way is that it takes a long time, which is a good thing, right? Because that length of fermentation is what allows us to create bread that is very flavorful. So the way that I do that is that once I've let the bread rest a little bit on the bench, on the work table there, what I'm going to do is then I'm going to leave it in the refrigerator overnight, and then I'll bake it the following day. It's important that we cover it with a little bit of flour, otherwise it'll stick in the banneton. So the way that I'm going to bake that the following day, and this is for those people who don't have a commercial deck oven, a bread oven in their home, a great way to bake this is in a Dutch oven. So what I do is I'm going to preheat the Dutch oven, and then I'll take the dough, I'll slash it on the top, put it on top of a sheet pan liner, and then just lower the sheet pan liner into the preheated Dutch oven. It's important that when you're baking the bread, give it about 25 minutes, and then remove the lid and bake it for another 10 minutes without the lid. That enables the dough to sort of, the bread to sort of dry out a little bit and get a little bit of a crispy crust. Now, you know when the bread is done, when you pick it up, and you can hear a hollow sound when you knock the bottom. And that's really the key. So next thing you should do is going to make sure that you cool it. So this is the interior of the bread. You can probably see that from the overhead camera. And you can see the seeds and grains and the different flours that are inside the bread. So what I did was that I worked with Chef Tony Sakaguchi to make a couple of recipes that use the bread as the focus of the dish. And we did that by making a Greek-inspired panzanella salad. This has tomatoes, feta cheese, heirloom tomatoes, cucumbers, bell peppers, and this is all tossed with a red wine vinaigrette, and we topped it with some really beautiful sunflower seed sprouts. The bread is a great base for tartines, and so we made 3 different tartines. The first one is a tartine with a salsa verde aioli underneath, grilled vegetables, and then a tuna confit with a wild green salad on top. The next one, this is a tartine that is grilled. So we grilled the bread. We spread it with mahumara, which is a Middle Eastern spread made with Aleppo peppers and breadcrumbs and walnuts. And grilled eggplant, a fresh tomato salad with a little drizzle of yogurt over the top of that. Finally, I think this is Anne's favorite. We have a dessert tartine. This is where Chef Tony Sakaguchi, she took the bread, warmed it up, and then spread it with grated dark chocolate. And while the bread was still hot, what happened is that it warmed it up and made it soft enough that we could put some of these roasted grapes, where she roasted the grapes in olive oil in an oven, more olive oil over the top, and then a little bit of Maldon salt over the top of that. I really feel, Anne, that breads like these could fundamentally change the way that we grow, mill, and use breads as commercial bakers, not only to enhance the biodiversity of how we grow grain, but also to change just the nutritional aspect of how we look at breads and sort of be able to move away from sandwiches. And the way that I really look at this is the way that I see these grains are the same way I saw heirloom tomatoes the first time I tried them 30 years ago. It really changed how I look at vegetables. And these grains and how to use these grains are really changing how I bake bread.
So inspiring, Erin. And I really love that with the tartine like that, you can load them up with a lot more vegetables and produce and things like that than a regular sandwich, right?
Yes, they really lend themselves to that. In addition to allowing for the person to feel full, the satiety. There we go.
Oh, don't ask me, I can never say that word. Satiated?
Feeling full. With having a wide variety of nutrients on the bread and in the bread that you just don't get when you have a big sandwich that you're eating that's full of other ingredients.
Well, and you can tell these stories of biodiversity, of the importance of using products that regenerate the land, right? And are good for the soil, and also with everything else that you're putting on top. So the storytelling is endless, which for operators is priceless.
Yes, absolutely, and on both ends, right? As a bread baker, as an operator of a bread bakery, or as the customer that may be selling to end users, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really gives us as bakers opportunities to contribute to that flavor of grain and that flavor of wheat beyond sort of what we've done in the past.
So when I am buying flours, how do I go about tasting the raw flour to know what it will taste like in my, let's say I'm not milling it, whether it is because I'm making at home or my restaurant doesn't have a mill. How do I get the very best possible flour and how do I taste it?
Well, the interesting thing about fresh milled flour, whether or not it comes from a commercial mill or you mill it yourself, is that it's similar to grinding your own coffee for coffee and your own coffee beans for coffee in the morning, right? And as that coffee bean is ground, just like the wheat or the grains, it ends up losing flavor over time. So one of the things, just like coffee, is that you can take some of the flour and smell it. And flour that is fresh will have that sort of earthy, grainy aroma to it. And it's really beautiful, right? But over time, that flavor really dissipates and that aroma dissipates. So rather than having to taste it and putting dry matter in your mouth, which may be a little unpleasant, you can really smell that flour. And what's great about a lot of these small farms and these wheat breeders is that they also mill. And so you can get either through distribution networks or on an individual basis, you can actually buy them directly from the farm by going through and finding them online. Most of them have online stores, and then they'll ship it to they'll mill it and ship it to you. And a lot of times the flour is only a couple days old by the time you get it, which is really exciting.
And there have been a lot of articles in the last year with everyone baking bread at home about the rise in local flours. So if you're not sure where your nearest mill and nearest flour producer is, Google it because most likely someone has covered it.
Yes, absolutely.
Can I ask you about those mills that you can have at home, right? Or maybe that's what you have at Greystone too, these fairly small mills. Are they worth it?
For me as a teacher, but also as a commercial baker, absolutely. I think that it gives us a way to access grains like wheat grains. We call them wheat berries, right? To access different wheat berries from different areas in my region. We are in Napa County, and just north of us in Mendocino County, there's actually a huge wheat economy. And the way that we have access to it is through a local cooperative distribution network. They don't sell it as flour, they only sell it as grains. So the only way that I have to use those to make flour is to be able to mill it myself. As you pointed out, is it worth it to have a mill at home? I think it depends on how much bread you bake, right? I think that there are lots of people, certainly in the past year and a half, that have gotten into this regular
Right here.
there you go, right? Have gotten into this regular cycle of making bread in their own kitchen. Really, over the past couple of years, even prior to the pandemic, the technology, if you will, it's kind of an odd thing to say about an old style of mill, but the technology of ways to mill flour at home for the end user has really expanded, and there's a lot out there, and it really is surprising when you taste those breads made with fresh milled flour, how much it tastes like wheat. When I say it, it sounds like, well, of course it does, but our experience with that here in the United States, we don't have that experience of being able to taste the flavor of wheat. Right? If anybody's ever had fresh milled polenta, I had fresh milled polenta for the first time, I don't know, 10 years ago, because we have a mill right up the street, and they mill fresh polenta. I had never, and they milled it that morning. I took it home, I made polenta. I'd never had anything like that in my life. It was unbelievable. And that same experience is what I had when I tried milling and using my own fresh flours. It's really been a huge change for me as a bread baker.
Great. Thank you, Chef Aaron and Anne. Everyone stay tuned till the end as our presenters will share their one sentence top takeaway from this presentation. But first, we would like to provide some brief instructions for the upcoming closing networking reception. In sessions, we have Peter Hoffman joining us for his Meet the Author conversation. We have networking. You can participate in a 4-minute one-on-one video chat. And today's icebreaker question, what is your one big idea for selling more sustainable dishes to consumers? or head over to the Innovation Hub to see culinary demos, insightful presentations, and gain plant-forward innovation inspiration from our generous sponsors. You can also continue this conversation with Anne and Chef Aaron in the Toribera Mediterranean Center Hub following this session, and enjoy the closing reception or closing networking reception. And don't forget to complete our summit evaluation. You can find that link in the summit chat. So now let's throw it back to our presenters to give us their final takeaway from today's session. Chef Aaron, would you like to start?
Sure. Recently, I read from Dan Barber that he said that we have to eat diversity. We have to eat the diversity that we grow. And that was really profound for me. And I think not only do we as individuals need to eat that diversity, I think we need to be able to share, create food and share it to the people we feed, either commercially, right, as an industry, or just as person to person. But I think eating the diversity, that's where we got to be.
Mm-hmm. And Anne, any last comments?
Mine relates very much to what Aaron just said. What's better for the planet tastes better too.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. And big thank you to Toribera Mediterranean Center for collaborating on this session. And thank you all for joining us today for this breakout and throughout the summit. We hope you've enjoyed the many insights and inspirations and all the networking with colleagues over the past 3 days. And we sincerely hope to see you all in person in Hyde Park next June for our 10th annual Menus of Change Summit. Thank you so much.
And we'll be in the TMC booth for lots more bread talk.
Definitely. I will drop a link. So those of you who are still with us, look in the chat and you can just click on that link to join them. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.